I see, Mr. Silverman, you're asking to be invited to the Slack channel. Yes. If Gary is out there, could you please let Jeffrey into the Slack channel?
Hi.
Hey, Nor.
How are
Welcome.
you? Thank you.
All right. We're going to get started in just a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, I see some questions already about why they can't see any other fellows. That's because we're in a webinar tonight. We're not on a regular Zoom call. And so I'll answer all the questions about why we're in a webinar versus a Zoom call in a second. Great question. Just going to bring up the slides. All right. Nora, can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Great. We're going full screen. Perfect. All right, here we go. Bonfire number 2. Tonight, I am super excited to welcome Nor as our co-host tonight. She is breaking new ground. She was a fellow last year, and so she is our first fellowship alumni to ever join us co-hosting a Bonfire, and we're really proud of her. So welcome, Nor.
Thank you. I'm excited to kick this off for Bonfire 2 on this end of things. I think it'll be fun.
Great. So if you haven't already, join the Bonfire channel in Slack. That is where we're going to be chatting tonight. So you've already noticed a couple tweaks. First, we're in a webinar. That's why you can't see all of the other people that are on this call. Last time we ran into some bandwidth issues, and this should solve it by being in a webinar. We are going to utilize the Q&A function in Zoom. You could see that Q&A there. You can add questions at any time and upvote the questions that you want to hear answered at the end. If we don't get to your question right now, we will get to it at the end of the bonfire. And then again, remember, the chat is still on Slack. So we're separating questions from chatting. Chatting's in Slack, questions are in Zoom. Make sure you keep chatting and keeping that commentary going.
It's cool. So to kick it off, we want to give you guys a few minutes to kind of think about the most well-designed thing that you've ever experienced. So whether that's a product or a piece of art or a video game or even a class you took, just the most well-designed thing you've experienced. Go ahead and put that in the Bonfire channel on Slack. Notion. I know we are all obsessed with Notion. Being able to figure it out, I do love that answer. The FIFA Museum, subways.
New York City subways. Ooh, democracy. I like that. Not New York City subways. The computer. Oh, stoicism. MCU. The highway system. That's an interesting one. VR room. IB theory of knowledge class.
Anything but the A-push curriculum, I can attest. Agreed.
Apple products. Good advertisement for them right there. Google Drive. Oh, Harry Potter. Quizlet. Quizlet's cool. Ooh, a nice pair of socks. I'll agree with that. If they don't fit right, then that's a problem.
The human body, that's interesting.
Wow. AirDrop, yes, that works pretty seamlessly. That's pretty incredible. Marvel, a lot of Marvel fans. Human body. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. You don't even have to think about breathing or having your heart beat. That's pretty good design right there.
Spotify, yeah. Cool. So we're going to kick it off with today's agenda. So first, we're going to be covering 3 inspiring and well-designed democracies. Thank you for your guys' responses, by the way, to the question of things that are designed well. We're going to take that in perspective of democracy, and then we'll link that to designing our own future. And then, as per usual, the Q&A hangout, and then the Q&A, and then the breakout hangout.
Perfect. So like Nor said, the reason we asked you about products or a building or anything that was well designed is because we're going to be talking about well-designed democracies tonight, and how to design our own better democracy. The 3 countries we're going to focus on are Norway, Estonia, and Taiwan. And as we go through these modern democracies, make sure to keep chatting in Slack, especially if you've heard of these before and you want to add to them. Remember the disclaimer, we are not the carriers of all the knowledge. We would love for you to share your own knowledge about these countries as we go through them. All right, first up is Norway, a Scandinavian country that consistently ranks as the world's best democracy by The Economist. Norwegians are actually automatically registered to vote and generally see 80% or more turnout in elections. That's really high. They are automatically registered, which is very different from many other countries, including the US, where there can be kind of a strict process for registering to vote. One of our fellows last year realized that people needed a notary in order to be registered to vote and started a nonprofit that was aimed at helping that. Other thing about Norway that's important is that there are 8 political parties vying for power. So there's no 2-party stalemate. One of our friends of CU named Lee Drutman, he's a professor that talks about the 2-party doom loop, why it's a problem to only have 2 parties, and that a solution to improving American democracy would be to have actually more parties and not just one-off third parties that kind of disappear after one issue, like say the Green Party, talking about parties that will maintain the kind of lasting power that Democrats and Republicans do. Politicians in Norway are true public servants. They don't make much money. They're not out to become millionaires after leaving office, which is often the case with American politicians. And the caveat here, though, is that Norway is a much smaller country than a country like the US. It's also a pretty homogenous population, doesn't have a lot of diversity, and they've had their own problems with white supremacist terrorism over the course of the last 20 years, very similar to the US. I put a link in here to more info about Norway if you want to check it out after the bonfire.
And then transitioning into the next country that we're going to talk about is Taiwan. So what specifically makes Taiwan special? Despite being under martial law until 1987 and still under constant threats from China, Taiwan has actually built a digital democracy. Additionally, civic hackers, in concert with the government, created online forums that generated consensus on important issues instead of creating division like more traditional social media platforms, which I'm sure is something that at least all of us have seen once. The results of these forums are then directly given to the legislators so they can hopefully be put into law. Also, Taiwan has had less than 1,000 COVID cases and only 9 deaths. And even considering the population of the country, that is still incredibly impressive. So for more, you can check out this article featuring Audrey Tang, who actually partnered with CU multiple times, which is really exciting. And also this argument for continued US support of Taiwan, which are both links that you can access in these slides.
Great. Third democracy is Estonia. So Estonia, former part of the Soviet Union, they've created a completely digital democracy all from scratch. This is a little bit easier than starting a country in the 1700s. You obviously couldn't build a digital democracy back then. So they've had the advantage of being able to do this starting in the 90s. In Estonia, every interaction that citizens have with their government can be completed online. And most importantly, voting. All right, you can do basically anything, pay a parking ticket. You can do anything except get married. And they made that, it's not because they lack the technology to do that, they just made the political choice that they wanted marriages to still have to happen in place. Anything else, you can do it online. To read more about the pros and cons of why other countries have had trouble replicating this success, though, I put a link into this for you to check out afterwards. It's not easy to build a digital democracy from scratch. And so key caveat, again, is the same thing with Norway and Taiwan, is that this is a much smaller country that was able to start essentially from scratch. So some takeaways about these countries are they don't have 100 years of inertia behind them that are preventing democratic reforms like older democracies like the US have. And that doesn't mean that you can just snap your fingers and create democracy. It's not that easy. There have been countless examples of that failing, including the last 20 years of Iraq. It was not easy to start democracy, especially when the U.S. after it had invaded it and a war had taken place there. Not easy to just start democracy from scratch. It also doesn't mean that constant change is desirable either. There's a reason that the framers of the US Constitution made it hard to amend it. They didn't necessarily want democracies to be changing with every whim. And so final caveat here is that none of this should prevent us from trying to improve our own democracies.
And so on that note, we want to do another rapid response round. So take 2 minutes to think of some other modern democratic countries that we missed that you think should be included. Go ahead and say what the country is and why you think it should be included. Sweden, Austria, Denmark, lots of Canada. New Zealand. Yeah. New Zealand for being great with COVID and the environment. Canada's free healthcare system. Ireland because of party list voting. Switzerland's neutrality and healthcare system. New Zealand, again, with their prime minister as well.
Ooh, I didn't know there was mandatory voting and automatic registration in Argentina. That's interesting. Mandatory voting is an issue that I think there's good arguments on both sides of that. Yeah, I'm sure that the challenges in India are even greater than in the United States, because like you said, it's 3-4 times as big of a country. Ooh, Iceland. Wow, in Australia you could find $25 if you don't vote. I did not know that. Canada, yeah, we talked last week about how Canada is one of the few fully formed democracies, according to that report from The Economist. They're in a much better place than the U.S. Last comment here, I like this. India finds a way to set up polling booths in really remote locations, provides aid for people who are illiterate, and it's the largest democracy in the world. Yeah, that's really cool that they can find polling booths in remote locations. Liechtenstein, Finland. Yeah, I mean, most of Scandinavia is held up as exemplars of democracy and education. Great. Okay. So thank you for your participation on that. There, like you noted, there are way more countries that we could use as inspiration for building democracy. And so appreciate you chiming in. So now we want to transition to a bigger question about what you would do if you could design a society from scratch, if you were able to create your own democracy. Don't answer that question yet, because we have a few other smaller questions to answer first. I want you to imagine a scenario before we get into how you would design things. Suppose way back early 1900s, a well-educated person sat down and decided to write a book predicting what life would look like in the 2000s. And this was not like a Nostradamus kind of thing that they were just throwing out thousands of predictions and hoping a few would come true. This was a person who really wanted to predict what life in 2000 would look like. So what would they predict? Would they be correct about a lot of things? I'm going to argue that this person would not believe almost everything that we take for granted in 2000. From their perspective, they would refuse to believe there was horseless carriages traveling at 70 miles per hour, flying machines capable of carrying passengers faster than the speed of sound, little devices in people's pockets that transmitted photos and sounds instantly, war devices capable of destroying all life on Earth, people traveling to the moon and back, and sending objects to Mars, right? You could make this list forever, but I can almost guarantee that a person in the early 1900s would not have been able to predict any of these things that we take for granted. And people would have thought you were crazy if you did predict those things in the early 1900s. So now, imagine you sat down today to predict what the 2100s would look like. Do you think you would be any better at predicting the future than the person in the early 1900s? Are we any more flexible or farsighted today than we were back then? And so in order to design the future, we must first become open to what is possible and become an expert in changing our minds when new evidence is presented to us. Think about this. The differences between 1900 and 2000, those 100 years, will probably be small compared to the differences between now and 2100. Right? Because technology is accelerating. The pace of it is accelerating. We proved that last week. And so how will we account for this in thinking about the future? Just for fun, what do you think 2100 will look like? What are your predictions for technology, for what government will look like, the environment, et cetera? You can put your answers in the chat. I'd love to hear what you think 2100 might look like.
Gene editing morality. We talked about this a little bit in philosophy the other day. We're like, how much of you can be replaced until it's no longer you. So that's interesting.
AI overlords. Space-time. Climate change will be awful. Queen Elizabeth's 174th birthday. Colonization of other planets.
Aliens colonizing us.
Ooh, maybe 200-year lifespans. 3D printing of organs. Space imperialism, interesting.
Sophia said no more rural areas. That's interesting to think about.
Flying cars and Betty White. Yeah, I think this is an honest answer here. I don't think I can actually fathom 2100, especially considering Moore's law for tech. I agree with that, but I hope that climate change will have been resolved or we'll be dead living in a wasteland. Maybe people no longer living on Earth. Wow, there's some dark ones here that will all be dead. I hope not. No death. Ooh, that's an interesting philosophical question as well, if that were to end. Self-driving cars definitely by then, maybe self-driving planes. So many good ones. Flying taxis. Flying taxis and flying cars have been predicted since the 40s and the 50s, and they still aren't around today. That's one thing that a lot of future predictors got wrong. End of the nation state, overpopulation. And man, you have so many good answers here. WALL-E level pollution.
The same deeply ingrained systemic issues, but with cooler gadgets.
All right, we'll move on to another question that Noor is going to present. Thank you for these answers. This is a really cool activity. But again, the point stands is that it's really hard for us to predict this, right? Almost impossible, especially, I love the answer about Moore's law for technology, about how fast tech moves. We have no idea what it's really going to look like.
Yeah. So go ahead and take another 2 minutes to think of this question. If you could start your own society from scratch, what would you start with and why? How would you form your government? How would you make laws? What about establishing currency, protecting your land, building infrastructure, or establishing a national identity or culture? You don't have to answer all of them, but throw a few ideas in the channel.
Yeah, well, what do you think would be your first thing you'd want to do? Is it necessary to form a government first, or can you start somewhere else? Start by compromising rather than debating. Democratic Republic. I would create a commune. Education, that's a cool place to start. Anti-racist philosophy. I see more compromise. National identity.
Trust rather than incentives.
One of our co-founders likes to talk about the trust economy, so I think that would be a good one. Man, these answers are flying in now.
Transparency, communes coming up a few times.
Society that emphasizes compassion and empathy. Love that.
A foundation of total equality. And then everyone has a platform to communicate ideas. Accessibility.
Education systems, education.
Educate with values before academics. That's a cool connection to last week's quest.
Human rights, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Wow, so many good answers. Okay, thank you for those responses. All right, so how do we design the future? You all have great ideas about where to start. We talked about how hard it is to predict these things, and so there's no easy answer. And there are tons of resources that you can look at when thinking about designing the future. I'm going to propose that we start by borrowing from the work of a future design thinker by the name of Jacques Fresco, a great name, who wrote a book called Designing the Future. This book also happens to be our recommendation of the week for you. We're not going to be able to cover the whole thing, obviously, and I encourage you to read it. At least the intro. The intro does a great job of framing up what we need to be thinking about when designing the future. And I'll share the link to it after tonight's session. And so why are we recommending this book to you? It's by no means the definitive text on design thinking. There are lots of great books you can read about this stuff, but it does a great job of explaining the challenges of designing for the future in plain, non-technical language. I think it's appropriate really for anyone, age 14 and up, maybe even younger. It also poses fascinating questions about design choices that we all seem to take for granted in our society. This one I wanted to share from you, and if you like what's in here, I think you'll like the book. I shouldn't even say it's a book. It's pretty short. You can read it in one day if you wanted to. So consider this. This is straight from the book. In 2019, roughly 40,000 people in the US died in car accidents, with hundreds of thousands more injured in those accidents. Were all of these accidents the fault of the drivers, the fault of individuals? Or was some of the fault, can it be attributed to the cars they were driving, the roads they were on, the traffic patterns that had been established, et cetera? Were those things the culprit? 40,000 people dead, right? Now, what about elevators? Elevators are another mode of transportation. Obviously, they don't go as fast. We don't think of them as dangerous, but they still move millions of people every day. And there's almost no accidents, right? It's less than 100 people a year die in an elevator accident. And so the question that this book poses, and which I want to pose to you, and I think is a good one, is why is it acceptable in our society that so many people every year die in car accidents, but not elevators? And so if you think that cars should be as safe as elevators, then I think this book might be for you. And I think it will help us think about designing the future. So you might be thinking at this point, well, that's cool. Like I get what you're saying there. It's, that many people should not be dying in car accidents. But what the heck does this have to do with democracy? Well, just like roads and cars and elevators need to be designed, democracy needs to be designed and built for the future too. Our first bonfire last week confirmed that it's broken in many places around the world and needs a radical rethinking, a radical redesign. Tonight, we looked at some inspiring examples in places like Norway, Estonia, and Taiwan. But we need those solutions to scale to larger, more diverse countries like the US or like India, for example. The next two units that we discuss are going to be on personal development and systems thinking. And those will start to give you the tools to become the civic superheroes that democracy needs in order to rebuild these democracies. If you're wondering how to do that, And if you haven't started filling out your leadership blueprint, that's a great place to start. That's where you can put these ideas down. And before we get to Q&A tonight, before we conclude, I've heard from some people that they're interested in going much more in depth in these bonfires. And I just want to remind us that the bonfires are really a place to go broad, not go very deep on these issues. This is a place for you to get inspired and then go off on your own and go on your juntos and explore these issues. And so if you feel like we're not diving deep enough into any of these things specifically, it's because we want to give you more options. It's a larger menu is what we're aiming for. All right.
Cool. So the weekly quest for this week that you can share with your Junto is a passions quest, because identifying your passions can help you determine where you'll be happiest, most content, and most productive as you choose a place to bring your immersive talents. Immense talents, not immersive talents. Remember, these quests aren't for us to grade or tell you what's right or wrong. They're for you and for you to have a discussion. You're just beginning to fill out your leadership blueprint to help you figure out who you are and what you want to do. And I know from last year, having it filled out, it's been really cool to kind of reference and just see how stuff changes over time. So really do try to pay extra attention to those quests.
The recommendation is the book that I already mentioned, Designing the Future. You're going to be able to download it for free at this link. I will also put it in my recap email tonight. You can feel free to chat about this book in Juntos with your peers, with anyone who might find it interesting. Some quick announcements. On this Saturday, March 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern, there's going to be a Cosmic Connection Hangout. At this event, you'll get to meet and dialogue with other fellows one-on-one. We are also actively looking to add Hangouts for fellows in other time zones. We've heard your feedback, and we are going to have some that are more convenient for you. All right, let's do some Q&A. I'm going to stop screen sharing in a second. And remember, stick around after the Q&A. We're going to do a breakout Hangout. Darielle is going to put a link for that breakout Hangout in the Slack. It will not be a part of the webinar. That way you can opt in to that breakout Hangout. So stick around. Darielle will put the link for breakout Hangout in the Slack. Let's do some Q&A. Happy birthday, Timmy. I apologize, the subtitles, captions weren't on earlier. If Norway, back to Norway for a second, if Norway doesn't have a lot of diversity, why would they need 8 political parties? That's a good question. I think a lot of those political parties have are closer in their belief systems than we are in the US. For example, in Norway, if you had a Joe Biden and a Bernie Sanders or an AOC, they would not be a part of the same political party. The Bernie would be part of a further left political party, and Joe Biden would be part of a more moderate left political party. And I think Norway has parties that are more like that, but we can research that too. All right, here's another one. Is it possible for governments in large countries like the US to ever get close to the scope of Taiwan's, Estonia's, and Norway's if it's so diverse and not really homogenous compared to these countries? Good question. And Nora, feel free to chime in if I'm speaking too much here, if you ever want to say any more. Okay, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, no, I was going to say also, kind of as it connects to the last question too, like, I think 8 political parties seems, considering we live in a 2 political party system, I think it seems like a lot, but when you really think about it, like finding someone who's able to like really represent your views and echo what you're trying to say, I I think it's important. So sometimes like 8 does feel like a lot, even if it doesn't seem like there isn't all that diversity of thought. But I think it's interesting and definitely important to have that many, if not more.
Yeah, and this question about larger countries, it is definitely hard for the U.S. to adopt reforms like are in Estonia, and one of the reasons why is we also have a system of federalism, right, where we have local, state, and federal government, and every state has a different mechanism for voting. That's the domain of the state. Same thing for education, right? That's done on the state and local level, and so it would be really hard to institute those reforms. I think the idea is that some individual states can start experimenting with those things with more of a digital democracy. The Justice Sandra Day O'Connor famously called the states laboratories of experiment, right? To experiment with democratic reforms, and then if they work, then they could bubble up to the federal level. And so I think it's unlikely for the U.S. to pass any federal legislation similar to those countries, but it's going to start at the state level. All right. How are we able to reform laws that are inherently racist? Well, you can repeal them and pass new laws, right? That's what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment did, right? Ended slavery, granted equal protection under the law to all people in the US, and granted voting rights to Black Americans, Black male Americans at the time. And then we saw that again in the 1960s, more laws were passed, like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act to reform the country. And so you could continually pass laws. How do we form more parties that will actually gain traction? Not easy, Claire. That is kind of the $1 million question. I would definitely recommend Lee Drutman's book on this. Again, he's a friend of CU, and maybe we'll have him on sometime. He talks about ways to form those parties. A lot of times it happens through grassroots organizing, right? Through people who are passionate, particularly young people like you. Start usually with single issue campaigns, and those can broaden into political parties. All right, here's another one. What would it essentially take to break the rigidness of the current bipartisan system, especially in a country like America? What do you think, Nor?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that like a huge part of it is personally just having like conversations with people, realizing like empathy can be at the crux of like first just like being able to have a conversation with someone who doesn't agree with you, which I feel like is said so often, but just having those like interpersonal connections, I think that it causes ripples of waves in terms of like how we interact and like set precedent for the government in a sense. But I also think that it's definitely a part of like why we're here is like be able to discuss ways that like in the same sense of like gaining traction as a party, being able to kind of break past like the barriers or the precedent that's been set of like a bipartisan system or just a two-party system in general in the US.
Great. Allison's question, how do we change the system of democracy if the American system is so rigid? It's kind of like we were talking about before. There still are ways that it can be changed, right? Through local laws, state laws, federal laws. Definitely not impossible. Question about the window behind me. No, it's a picture, not a window. Can you explain what a multi-party system is? Yeah, a system that has more than 2 political parties will be a multi-party system. Serious question. Yes, say something to that person inappropriate that he made that comment. Christina, how to use the leadership blueprint on Notion. Can you message Madison from CU on Slack? She'll help with that. One of the founding fathers said that a 2-party system would end us. Do you think we're seeing the breakdown of the system now, or is it really stronger than ever? Yeah, I mean, George Washington, in his farewell address, warned about the dangers of political parties. Madison and Hamilton were aware of factions, and were scared. I don't think that it's doomed right now, but there's no reason that we can't have more political parties. There's nothing that says in the Constitution there only have to be two. The major reasons why we have two have to do with how our electoral system is set up. If we didn't have single member districts in the House of Representatives, and if we didn't have winner take all elections, then we'd actually have more political parties. Can you craft a book list for CU fellows? Yeah, I think we're definitely going to be recommending something every week, and eventually maybe we will come up with a book list.
I also think there is a book channel if you want to invite yourself into that too.
Nicholas's question, we're probably not going to answer this here, but it is definitely okay to call someone out for saying something inappropriate. Great. Breakout Hangout is after this. There's going to be a link where you can hang out with other fellows to discuss tonight's lesson. Do you see any other questions you want to take, Nora?
Super quickly, Elisa's question. I think one of the, no doubt, like being able to recognize flaws in your country is patriotic, but I think that one of the cool things about being here is even being able to speak about it or like feel like you can reform it. Just because I know, that's one of the privileges of living here is the fact that you can actively call out the government to a certain extent.
What happens if we can't make it to a bonfire? Yeah, I send a recording after each session. It'll be about 30, 45 minutes after the bonfire ends. I'll send a recording. It'll also be in the Slack. Juntos have met once so far. They meet every week though. So after bonfires, Juntos meet later that week. And we'll just take one more question. Can meritocracy be employed in a non-discriminatory way if equitable support systems are used? I mean, that's another massive question that people are spending their lives on, is figuring out, for example, how to test middle school students to decide what high school they should go to, right? Should that be a pure meritocracy, or should there be other considerations that are taken into account? Again, not going to solve that here, but that is something that if you want to explore that deeper, like that is a great project to be working on. And once you've kind of gathered all of the evidence, once you've examined all the systems that are involved here, the education system in particular, then maybe you can make some recommendations or decide where you want to put your efforts in that. And we'll be talking about systems thinking later on in this fellowship, and I think that'll really help with answering a question like that. Great. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up for now. I want to thank Nora for joining us.
Well, thank you. It was nice being able to interact with you all, and I'm excited for next week's bonfire and this week's Juntos too.
Yeah. If you want to join a breakout hangout session, Dariel is going to post a link in the Slack where you can join that call, and then he'll place you into a room. If not, thanks so much for hanging out with us tonight. Enjoy your Juntos this week, and we'll see you next week.
Cool. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.